Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast, where we attack shame anywhere we can get it, especially sexual shame, religious shame, really any shame just kind of sucks. So we try to go after it in any way we can. And I'm super excited to introduce you to my guest here in a minute. I wanted to give a few announcements of things that are going on in my practice and things to keep you alerted to. So one exciting piece of news is that I made my debut on Hulu on Secret Lives of Mormon Wives. As I know that was super exciting to see myself on there. So for those of you who maybe are interested in that, you can check it out. It's on Hulu and kind of a fun show on LDS culture and themes that have to do with a lot of actually the things that we talk about here on the podcast. We're talking about the they're dealing with the intersection of like their families and being influencers and being Latter-day Saints, some of them, and sexual shame, substances, all the things. So it's kind of an interesting cultural look at our community. Let's see. Secondly, we have quite a few groups coming up. I wanted to alert people to. I have the Reclaiming Female Sexuality group, the Recovering from Male Sexual Shame group. We have a Mixed Orientation Marriage group coming up, and also Navigating Ethical Non-Monogamy group coming up. And they're all going to be actually in the evening, which is usually a little bit more popular than my daytime sessions. So if you've been thinking about that, any of those things relate, that can be a way that you can work with me and in a group setting, which first of all is cheaper, which is a plus. And second of all, there's just magic in group settings, people. So I don't know, there's so much I can do in individual work, but in a group setting, there's kind of like magic that happens in the healing department. So I encourage you to look at that at my website, natashahelfer.com, or Symmetry, which is simcounseling.com, are both of the websites, and I'll link to those if you're interested. I also have a ketamine session coming up for the Reclaiming Male Sexual Shame group. So I'm really excited to work with some of the men around those topics with ketamine on board, and that will be on June 21st, which you probably need to start signing up for if you want to go to, because it takes a few weeks to get the prescription for the ketamine. So
it's a special date too, the summer solstice.
Oh, I hadn't thought of that. Ooh, that'll be fun to weave that in there. So, all right, without any further ado, I would like to introduce you to my guest, Colleen Johnston, and the topics that we'll be talking about, which have a lot to do with sexual shame and her history with the LDS Church and kind of some of the insights that she's had. But I'll read her bio really quickly. She's a mother of 9, that's no small task, whose life journey spans the extremes of Mormon orthodoxy and radical self-liberation. Raised in both conservative Utah and rural Maine, Colleen was shaped by the rigid expectations of purity culture and the deep shame often instilled by religious teachings around sexuality. After surviving public shaming, sexual trauma, addiction, homelessness, and incarceration, she returned to the church and immersed herself in its teachings, only to later confront disturbing truths about its history and leave it behind for good. For nearly 2 decades, she facilitated addiction recovery meetings and lived with unrelenting devotion to church doctrine. Today, Colleen has left the Mormon church and is an advocate for body autonomy, open sexual education, and parenting without shame. Her story is one of painful transformation, reclamation of self, and fierce love for her queer, gender fluid, and unapologetically authentic children. I got shivers just reading that. That is a really interesting bio, and I'm so excited to dive in a little deeper with you on some of these topics. And thank you so much for being on our show. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so let's start with giving us a little more, right? I usually like to start with people just sharing a little bit about their history, how they grew up. What do they feel were some monumental kind of core things that happened, either memories or circumstances that occurred in childhood and emerging adulthood that leads you to where you are today? So why don't we start there?
Okay. Well, my mother and father were from Maine, and they both came from really toxic families. My mother was in an alcoholic and physically abusive family, and my dad was in a family where there was a lot of incest and child sexual abuse, and that it was, I think that came down. He didn't get abused, but his sisters did. But that the perpetrator, did it to all the grandkids, it seems like. So definitely some, really disturbing things that caused my parents to wear blinders as they parented. But they joined the church when my dad was 10, and then when he was going to marry my mom, she joined at 18. And I think that my mom just liked the idea of the church because it was no drinking, no smoking, like family and love and everything like that. And she just wanted to get the hell out of Maine and never go back. So they moved to Utah, like a lot of people did back in the 60s. And they came here, and I was the youngest of 5, but I was a surprise. My mom she's told me before she passed, she told me that she thinks she would have been a good mother to one child. But the gospel that she learned in Maine was birth control is evil, playing with face cards is evil, all kinds of really, almost kind of like, not pilgrims, but, like just that old, like Christian thinking that's kind of, gosh, I can't think of the word, that there's just suspicions and like, anyway. So
like puritanical or like
yes,
rigid or orthodox, right? And I think even as you're talking about that, because I remember going to BYU and getting my playing cards out and saying, "Hey, who wants to play gin rummy?" and one of my roommates like had like this very stark reaction, like, "Natasha, those are of the devil." And I'd never heard of anything like that. But
right.
Here are 2 Mormon girls, right, coming from 2 different, very geographical spaces in the United States. And one of us had gotten that message and one of us hadn't. And I think sometimes we forget that even within the same religion, we get very different kind of, depending on where we live and who our parents are, the flexibility or the rigidity can be quite varied.
Yeah. Yeah. And, any complaints that I made against my, pedophile grandfather, it was met with, but he joined the church. Let's focus on what a wonderful blessing that's been for everyone. So that was, mixed messaging and kind of invalidating about how much damage was caused by, one person. But when my mom and dad got to Utah, my mom was really surprised at how, loose people were with the religion, birth control and, playing cards and maybe doing a little shopping on Sunday, just drinking caffeinated beverages, like all the things that she was taught were forbidden. And so she was kind of upset that she'd been taught such a rigid orthodoxy. And then she saw that so many people weren't doing that. And I think that she relaxed in her Mormonism. Like, I don't think she's ever really hardcore. She'd go out sunbathing out back with her tube top on, like, um, but so my parents, well, sorry, going back to when she found out that she was having me, like her first response when she found out she was pregnant was, oh shit, not another one. And so I was kind of grown from the very beginning with that attitude of like not being wanted.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of a thing that I struggle with all through life is, not feeling wanted. But my parents ended up divorcing because they were both kind of lax in their, practice of Mormonism. And I remember my mom just told us when it was general conference, we had to watch one session, but my dad at some point started getting really churchy and it drove them apart. Like my mom couldn't handle like how, like strict he was becoming with it. Cause she just thought, it was just church is good, go to church, have friends. So when they
had a mixed faith marriage, even within the same religion.
Yeah. But, like between ages, 1 and 10, I had been molested by family, friends, neighbors, and it was just so strange to me to look back. Like I have a 6-year-old daughter and, I was 5 years old and I biked over to the undeveloped land in Highland, Utah. And there was this tree house with a swing and all the neighborhood kids would go over there sometimes. And, I was there one day and a 10-year-old boy, asked me to do something that just boggled my mind. But I'm like, okay. And then I just rode my big wheel home and I never told anybody about it. And I think that shows from the very beginning that I didn't feel like I had somebody that I could talk to about bad things happening. And also my attitude right off the bat of wanting to be accepted and not telling people no. So
when you say right off the bat, I'm like, isn't that just completely wired into us, right? That desperate need to fit in, that desperate need to feel important, and to feel accepted by the people around you. So of course you had those inclinations, right? That's just being part of a pack animal that we are as human beings.
Yeah, but my parents divorced when I was about 11 and my mom stayed here in Utah and my dad moved back to Maine and he was going to marry a lady that he'd met here in Utah and she moved out there and married him and she had 5 kids already and I was older than all of them. So I went from being the baby of the family to being the oldest at home because as we moved, the oldest were graduating and my 15-year-old sister didn't get along with my stepmother at all. And so she went to Job Corps. So that was hard. And then just not having my mother around and my stepmother kind of like pushing me away, like always wishing that she didn't have any reminders about my dad's previous life. But she was nice, like on paper, like she never said anything, but you feel it from kind of covert narcissists. But I would say that because I was sexualized as a child and, I started masturbating really early, like even like, rubbing on the chairs in class at school, and having to have teachers say, hey, Colleen, don't do that, and then I learned that, oh, it's something that you have to hide, so I spent a lot of time in my room and I didn't I didn't really feel guilty about it. Like I was embarrassed if somebody caught me, but I didn't really feel guilty about it. And then as I went into high school, I I was really like both ends of the spectrum. Like, um, tried drinking and partying and, having sex and all those things. And then I also wanted to get perfect attendance at early morning seminary. I played the piano and organ at church, and, wards in Maine are really small. And even though I didn't feel guilty about sexual acts, I knew that I had to confess them because that's just part of the deal. And I didn't want to lie to go on a temple trip. And
Mm.
so when I confessed having sex to the bishop, and I was 16 years old, and now looking back on it, I'm like, that was perfectly normal. Like my parents should have, instead of when they found out, they sent me to a psychiatrist. Instead, I think they should have said, were you safe? Who was it? Yeah, I kind of alternated year to year. Like, I'm going to be a really good girl this year. And then the next year, I was like, screw it. Really sadly and ironically, like, I was trying to be a good girl. And, I'd already had sex a few times, but I went on my first legitimate date at 16 years old with a cute guy from school. Um, we went out and had a really nice time. He drove me out to the lake where his family had a camp, and we were just standing there in the moonlight and everything, and we kissed. And I was like, oh, I got to get home by my curfew. And we jumped in the car, and he locked the doors and he date raped me.
Wow.
And I froze,
Wow.
like I was stunned. And he didn't hurt me, but um I just remember, like, when he was done, he said, I'm a lot better in a bed. And then I just stared at the clock in his car the whole way home, just wondering, what signal did I give off to him that that was okay? And really, like, kind of wrecked me because I was like, I had no idea why he felt like that was an okay thing to do. And then he kind of spread rumors about me at school. And um
Mm.
but then I kind of was like, I felt rebellious about my sexuality. And I think I was close to graduating high school. And when I graduated, I went to BYU, but I wasn't there to obey the honor code. I started drinking. I'd keep warm beer under my bed so I could sneak it.
Mhm.
And um, I got pregnant. I went to visit somebody from Maine who had moved to New Mexico for Thanksgiving. And, I got pregnant the one time we did it. And when I found out a couple of weeks later, I picked up the yellow pages and I went straight to abortion. And that strikes me as I was so um, conditioned with the purity culture of church,
Mhm.
that it was more shameful to tell my family that I was sex than it was to have an abortion.
Mm.
And I still don't really understand why. Like, I didn't even consider keeping the baby for even a second.
Mhm.
Embarrassment and humiliation that would be on my family.
Mhm.
So, and then I left BYU because I was like, somebody else deserves this spot. And actually, you and I would have been at BYU about the same time.
What years did
So,
you go?
yeah.
What
But
years? What years did you go to BYU?
91, 92.
Oh, yeah. I was there from 90 to 94. So yes, we would have been there in the same energetic space.
Yeah, I lived at Rain Tree.
I
Yeah,
remember Raintree.
yeah,
Yeah, that's interesting.
yeah. So I think
So,
I left the church then,
okay.
like living off campus with a bunch of jaded upperclassmen who were only there because that's the only place their parents would pay for college, or they'd get a car if they graduated from BYU, but they didn't want to be there. And they were, you know, driving up to the U or Utah State to party on weekends. And I went along with them. But I went to church one time, I think, at a student ward,
Okay.
and I didn't go back.
And do you feel like when you stopped attending church at that point, was it like you had quote unquote lost your testimony, or was more just like, I don't fit, I'm not obeying the standards, I'm not, following the commandments, so therefore why even bother? Or was it so less of a testimony thing and more of a behavioral standard thing, or was it more of a
It
testimony?
was a combo of everything, but the one time I did go, um, it was weird. I thought everybody's the same age, same color, same demographic, like just so homogenous. And and it was so big. The church I grew up in was really small.
Mhm.
And so, um, you know, after that one time attending, my roommates and I would just stay home and watch R-rated movies on Sunday. And one day my visiting teachers came by, and it felt like they said, "So, we noticed that you weren't at church today, and we thought you might want to know what the lesson was," or something. It just came off as really like snobby and superior. But I just realized that I wasn't like the people there, and I wanted to do fun things.
Mhm. And so you went and did a typical confession, it sounds like, when you were 16, is that correct?
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
and is that due to the date rape, or was that due to other things that you were doing more consensually? Like, how did you ever make sense of the date rape? Like, did you take
Yeah.
responsibility for that
I never confessed the date rape to anybody. I
yourself?
told my best friend, but that was it. But I knew that wasn't my fault. I knew it didn't,
Okay.
that I didn't have a part in anything bad about that. Um, but I did confess to the bishop about having sex when a temple trip was. I have a couple friends who said, "Why would you tell the truth?" Like, because we went to Washington, D.C. on our temple trips, and it was really fun, like an overnight bus ride, spend the day in DC at the museums, and then drive back.
Mhm.
But he put me on. He just fellowshipped me,
Okay.
so I was the only person who could play the organ in our ward, and he took that calling away.
Oh.
And so I was sitting in the audience or in the congregation, and the other lady up there who's struggling is looking at me like, "Why aren't you up here?" And then I'm not taking the sacrament. And it just felt like a real public shaming. And
Mm.
he did hand me a Miracle of Forgiveness book. And I think I read the first 2 pages, and I'm like, boring. Like, I'm not reading that. So, but
Oh man, so much of this sounds very similar threads, right? To I think how I was growing up as well. But how do you feel like looking at it now from the perspective of a grown woman and thinking of yourself as a 16-year-old girl in this office with obviously a much older man who has this authority and is in a sense playing God, right? Because he's representing Heavenly Father's wishes or something. How do you feel he did in regards to actually ministering to you, to getting curious about why you might be, showing up in these ways that, I guess what I'm getting at is that it doesn't seem like there was a very trauma informed approach to your situation. And how do you feel the bishop played a role in being trauma informed or being actually not trauma informed at all?
yeah. Well, I think that back in the, 80s, at least my bishops, they didn't take much time to get to know the youth. I think that's kind of a new um, program that they've instituted to try and hold on to the youth, is to get the bishop to be their pal. And like, I barely knew the name of the bishop. I felt like he kind of just said, "Oh, okay, well, I got to take away your calling and you can't say prayers, whatever, like that. You can't take the sacrament. And he's like, and read this book. And it was that. It was just so like impersonal. Like I'm glad that he didn't try to go into detail and ask about
Mhm.
intimate questions and oh, some of the horrible things I've heard people have
Mhm.
been asked.
Right.
But yeah, he just didn't really care. He just was going by the handbook and sent me on my way. But
So
my
uh,
parents never talked to me about it.
your parents never talked to you about it,
Oh,
meaning they noticed that, like, did you talk to them? Did you say, I'm going to the bishop and doing this? Or you're just saying that they, as they noticed you not taking the sacrament or
yeah, I
not?
think the bishop informed them.
Oh, and
So, um, but they sent me to a psychiatrist one session, and I just sat there with my arms folded and I wouldn't talk because I thought it was stupid that I was being sent to a psychiatrist
Mhm.
for having sex as a teenager. But they never talked to me about sex or safe sex or anything. And, thank God, like the other guys that I had sex with in high school, they all used condoms, like their parents had taught them. And, so I'm really grateful for that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
A pretty hands-off approach, not overly detailed and creepy, but also not very ministering or caring. Just kind of like, oh, this is information you're giving me. This is the punishment I need to dole out. Good luck.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
And was that the only time you went in to confess, or as you're going to BYU and things like that, were there different bishops you were confessing to, or not
Oh,
so?
I think that was the one big one because it was, like approaching a temple trip.
Mhm.
So yeah, I
Yeah.
thought, well, might as well take care of it. And I was going to early morning seminary. And looking back on it now, I realized that is sleep deprivation, like,
Mhm.
brainwashing.
Mhm.
It was so hard. I'm still tired from it. I had to be there at 5:30 in
Right.
freezing cold temperatures and
Mhm.
yeah, but yeah, I didn't really get into confessing anything after that. And I think that as I did things, even though I didn't feel like I was, I didn't feel bad doing it, like having sex with somebody or, making out with girls or whatever, like I didn't feel bad about that. I really enjoyed it, but I think I still had the shame, like, because you're supposed to have shame. Do you know what I mean? Like, oh, like, how could I ever tell anybody any of these things? Like I have to keep it secret because it's considered such a sin. But
Mhm.
after I left BYU, I moved back home to Maine for a little bit and I stayed at my dad's just for a little bit. And he said, your lifestyle isn't conducive to our family because there were still a lot of little kids at home. And he told me that I had a couple of weeks to find a place, and I said, I'll move out today. I went over to the homeless shelter.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I just stubborn, like screw you. So, and that was very strange because I just lived 3 miles away from my family and I didn't see them. I saw them probably two times ever before I moved back to Utah again.
Okay.
But
Okay.
yeah.
And were you able to get yourself situated outside of the homeless shelter,
Oh
or?
yeah, yeah. I was only there about a week, and then I ran into a friend from high school who we were in musicals together, and no surprise, he's gay. And I said, let's get an apartment together. So we did, and we had fun, and we did drugs and drank a lot, and it was kind of fun. Like it was my first time being an adult, and
Mhm.
did that, but it got old pretty quick. And so I moved back to Utah because, my mom was still here and my older siblings were here.
Mhm.
But yeah, so not too long after living here, I got pregnant again.
Okay.
And when I told the guy, he said, yeah, this really isn't a good time for me.
Mm.
And so he drove me and he paid for half of it. And then
Mm.
he dumped me, like literally broke up with me. And that
Wow.
was pretty, heartbreaking because, my sister was out playing pool with him that night, so it was just like,
Mm.
feeling like I wanted to die. Also feeling really guilty because I felt like, you know, I did feel like abortion was wrong, but I also thought like bringing a child into a lifestyle that's like lots of drugs, instability. At the time I was doing a lot of acid, like LSD, like twice a week for a year. And I thought for sure the baby would be damaged and deformed and everything. So I didn't keep that baby. And then I think I went into a depression about it. I felt like, okay, wow, I've killed two babies, and that's when I started like getting really into drugs and not caring. And I met a guy who, well, actually, sorry, I was going to join the Air Force because I wasn't old enough to go on a mission, which I thought if I was old enough to go on a mission, I would do that and that would help me get on track. But I called my dad and asked him what he thought I should do. And he said he thought I should go join the military. I said, okay. So I went up to the Air Force Base and did really well on the tests and had my date to go to boot camp. But before I left, I wanted to do heroin just once. So I met this really cute, like, you know, dirty pirate looking guy. And he worked at the restaurant where my sister worked at the old Salt City jail. And, at the end of the night with all their cash tips, there was a lot of cocaine going around and a lot of drinking. And I asked him if he had ever done heroin. And the people I'd asked leading up to him, they were like, ew, no, why would I ever do that? And he said, yeah, I've tried it.
Mm.
So, I'm 10 years younger than him. I'm like 19, he's 29. I've got cash. I'm like, go buy me drugs. And he was loving it because he was actually like a full-on heroin addict and was starting to go into withdrawals. And so we did it, and I thought it made me fall in love with him, but I think I felt in love with the feeling of the drug.
Mm.
But we were together for a year and a half, and yeah, I was stealing to support our habits, and we moved around all over the place, like Seattle, San Francisco, San Diego, stole a friend's car, like just such a mess. And then I got arrested a few times, and his mom put her house on lien, like to get us out of jail. And we still left the state. It just was just so selfish and bad. But I realized recently that one thing that really saved me from dying from drugs was I was tired of going to jail. I didn't like being arrested, but we were in San Francisco and they had overcrowding. And since I wasn't a violent offender and I wasn't dealing drugs, they'd let me out.
Mm.
And um, I suggested to him that I become a stripper. And I think because of his Mormon upbringing, he said, no way. Like also he was a jealous guy. He was nice, but he was jealous. And I think that really saved me because if I had become a prostitute, like, a stripper and then probably a prostitute, yeah, I think I would have died in the streets for
Stayed in,
sure.
stayed in that lifestyle. Hmm.
Yeah. But we kept talking about how we wanted to get married and get our lives cleaned up and have kids and go back to church and everything. But that was
Okay.
just a pipe dream.
And so you didn't end up going to the Air Force thing that you were starting to sign up for. You ended up going this route instead. So,
Yeah, I called the recruiting officer and just said, yeah, I can't go to boot camp. I've been doing some drugs. And he said, oh, what, pot? And I said, heroin. And he's like, well, good luck.
mm,
And that was the end of that.
Okay. So how do you get from that space that you're in your kind of emerging adulthood years to then getting back to church and running pornography addiction
I know, right?
meeting
Yeah.
for like 20 years, right?
Hmm. Well, I think, I always felt like I would go back to church. And I think what kept me from going back was that I knew that I'd probably be excommunicated. And I ended up going to a year-long rehab in San Francisco, and that's what separated me from that guy
Okay.
permanently. So that was heartbreaking, but I'm so glad that it happened.
How
And
did
then
you
I decided to go to church to find a roommate.
Hmm.
And the bishop, you could tell both arms were covered in tattoos, like you could tell through his white shirt. And so it was kind of cool to have a bishop who'd, lived a life and then joined the church. And I found a roommate and she was great. And I was still sober from the rehab. But after a few weeks or something, I started drinking again. And I told her, and I was crying about it. And she ended up moving out a while later. And I got into meth, and I think that took me down harder and faster than the heroin. So eventually, like after kind of going crazy, I got back to Utah. And moving doesn't always solve your problems, but sometimes it helps a lot to get that distance. And so I decided to not do drugs, but just drink.
Okay.
And so that went on for a little while, but then I met my husband.
Okay.
He'd come from Australia to visit his dad, and his visa was only for 3 months. And so I went to Europe for a week, a trip that was already planned, and he and I really missed each other. So I thought that was a good sign. And then when his visa was almost up, he had to make a decision. Like, is he serious enough about me to stay illegally? Or is he going to go back to Australia? So that was a little stressful, but he did stay.
Okay.
And then we got married about 9 months later, and immediately started talking about going to church. And he'd been baptized as a kid in Australia, but never really went. So when we went to church, we were in a downtown ward that love bombed us. Like they were so excited to have a couple in the ward who wanted to take the temple prep class and gospel essentials and everything. And I played the organ. And I think that he wasn't really into the church, but he liked being love bombed. And so we did make a few moves and we got loved bombed each place. But I still was on painkillers after I stopped drinking. So I used to go a month each year without drinking, like February, because it's the shortest month. And he said, "Oh, I'll join you." And we'd been drinking a lot of alcohol. And after the month was over, I was eager to start drinking again. And he said, "No way, life is so much better without drinking." And I was like, "Oh." And
Mhm.
so I was on pain pills from a car accident where I broke my neck.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, I kept doing those, but we still got ready to go to the temple. We got sealed. I was secretly doing painkillers, and I got a DUI on
Mm.
painkillers, and I was sent to jail.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
yeah. And when I was in jail, um, like my husband wouldn't accept my collect calls. I was really alone, and I was quarantined in my own cell. So, it was just really lonely. And day two, the librarian came in with a cart of books, and the Book of Mormon was on there. And even though I'd gone to seminary, I'd never read the whole Book of Mormon. And so I thought, well, I guess this is as good a time as any. So I plowed through it. And um, this has been a really hard thing for me to reconcile, leaving the church. because I related so much to Alma the younger, like the new heart, everything like that. And like becoming a new creature. And when I came out of jail, like my addictions were taken from me, and I really felt happy and free and peaceful. And so I think that's when I got really serious about church, and I got really into going to the temple. And I found out about the addiction recovery program, and the judge had court ordered me to like 3 AA meetings a week. And in AA, they say go to 90 meetings in 90 days. And so I kind of did a mix of AA and the addiction recovery meetings. And before long, I was helping facilitate the meetings. And I really liked how I could have my higher power as, part of my recovery. Because in AA, especially in Utah, sometimes people get kind of bristly if you talk about the church or Book of Mormon or whatever. But at the church addiction recovery meetings, I felt like I could talk about anything and everything and be really comfortable. But after a few years, a lot of people would come in with pornography addiction. And, even like they'd overshare, and it was like really bad. And there were meetings specifically for men in pornography addiction, but they would still come to the general addiction meetings, I think, because they just were too ashamed to walk in the door that was for pornography addiction. And I couldn't help them a lot because I'm a woman, like they really encourage women to work with women and men to work with men. And so I would just, tell them there's this other meeting would be really good for you. But still, over the course of years, I helped a lot of people as much as I could with substance abuse and with sex and pornography abuse. And I didn't think about it then, but now my attitude is if you don't have to hide your pornography use and you don't feel shameful and dirty afterward, I think that it really kind of takes away the tendency to hide it and to, just keep in that shame addiction cycle. And so some of these guys I think back on, like if they just could look at porn a few times a month when their wife wasn't in the mood, like they would probably be okay. And because that's been my experience, like as I've left the church, that because at one point, well, actually over several years, especially when I was pregnant, oddly enough, like I got so addicted to porn, like walking by a computer was a trigger for me. Like one time I even felt like Satan said, look at porn, like anyway, but I ended up, using the 12 steps for that, going to LDS Family Services, working with a therapist, doing the book, some kind of book about turning away or turning toward the Savior. But I felt like that was helpful, but it was more like just being able to talk to somebody, about it. And I kept confessing to bishops, and it was awful because it really like convoluted like my sexual feelings with priesthood leaders. Like you go to look at some porn and my first thought is my bishop, and I have to keep that out of my mind the whole time. And then, like after I've had an orgasm or something like that, and I'm thinking about the bishop again, just really twisted. But I would, because I really did want to be, a Mormon in good standing. And the best bishop who worked with me was when we lived in Sydney, Australia. And he took away the sacrament from me for 2 weeks and said I needed to go to the addiction recovery meetings, and I could see the LDS therapist there, but he wanted me to report back in 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks after that. And I felt really supported by that, by him being really caring about helping me out. But yeah, I feel also like the garments in my marriage were a real hindrance to us having a healthy sexual relationship. Like literally, if I wanted to turn my husband off, I would put my garments on
Mm.
and like walk around and like uh, I feel like it was not healthy in our marriage. Very, very
Okay.
disconnected.
So a few things I want to I just for clinical purposes, I just want to clarify that, when we're talking about pornography addiction, that language, it's really language that's used in these kind of church settings, and it's not really clinically viable, as far as like usually we use the terms more like either out of control sexual behavior or compulsive sexuality, when it really is like a clinically kind of considered issue, which means that people are doing behavioral things that are really interfering with their day-to-day lives. We're talking about hours on end of, daily habits, which of course, again, is not always the typical presentation of people who show up at these types of meetings, right? There's a lot of people who can show up at these meetings and even consider themselves and label themselves, identify themselves as porn addicts when they're looking at porn a few times a month or even a few times a year, quite frankly, or even a few times a week, which is all considered kind of fairly normative sexual, behavior, but not so much in conservative religious spaces where, of course, this behavior is seen as against the law of chastity in our particular faith community. That's the language we would use. And therefore, it's really a zero-sum game. Like you're not really supposed to watch any porn or masturbate at all. And so any issues with that can be seen as, of course, betrayal from the spouse who maybe finds out about it. Like you mentioned earlier, it's oftentimes secret because people are ashamed of what they're doing or don't want to admit to what they're doing because of the consequences. And so then, of course, what we know about human psychology is that then anytime you're in that kind of shame cycle, and it kind of creates this anxiety feedback loop, which then it's more likely that that behavior will actually increase instead of decrease when you're feeling all of this shame. And so although I do think that a lot of people, including yourself, are saying these programs can be helpful, I just want to kind of put this overlay as far as educationally. The reason why they're often helpful is because there is community. There's an ability to talk about things openly instead of having it all secret.
Right.
And there's other people, so you don't feel alone or kind of crazy or broken, because you're
Yeah.
the one, right? And so those are things that are actually very helpful about many of these programs. The critique that many of us sex therapists would have about the programs is that you can have community and conversation and support without calling it an addiction that isn't really scientifically valid, and also get help with people. And especially, and if there is compulsive behavior around it, where it really is now kind of more of a clinical issue rather than a religious morality issue, there's other types of help that would be deemed correct in a treatment plan that's done by a therapist who's trained in these kinds of things. And one of the problems that I see in these conservative religious communities is that a lot of the therapists are also religious themselves. And so they are complicit with this kind of like sex and porn addiction treatment modality that really doesn't show a lot of effectiveness in the long term for people kind of going through those types of treatment. Then not to mention, of course, the bad apples in the communities that take these kinds of modalities and really exacerbate them, like the Jodi Hildebrands, the Maurice Harkers, all these people that really cause quite a bit of emotional and psychological damage when people really shouldn't have had a clinical identity or diagnosis to begin with.
Right.
And so this, complicates, all that kind of stuff, because I'm sure you did find that people were helped by these programs. What are your feelings? Maybe this is premature to ask you this in the history of your telling your story, but you've moved away from the church right now. And so what are your both maybe like looking back on these programs that the church is providing, what would you say are the strengths? Because I do think there are strengths to the church addiction program. And also, what do you see now as the limitations, or now having a different sense of how you think about things? What are maybe some harmful aspects of those programs?
Yeah, well, I know that when the program first started at my home ward in Maine, the Relief Society president showed up with a clipboard and was taking notes on who was there and what their problem was, and felt like she
Oh,
was entitled to know what was going on in the ward so that she could be helpful. It's like so many people in the church just don't understand like what recovery is, what the 12 steps are, because it's all about following the commandments. And if
mhm.
you don't follow the commandments and you sin, then you repent. And it's just kind of, like pinging back and forth. Like there's no, I don't know. I feel like the church recovery groups are really good because there's no judgment. Like it's just so welcoming and beautiful. And we don't care what the worst thing you've ever done is. We're glad you're here. And if you've been gone for a while and you come back, we're glad you're not dead. It's like, it's incredible. Um,
Wouldn't it be nice if church was that way?
exactly. I mean, I joked a bunch of times about if I could just take the sacrament there, that's all I would need. Because it
Mhm.
was just so spiritual. It was all about the Savior. I really did love it so much, but my personal recovery didn't happen there. Mine happened at AA meetings
Mhm.
outside of it, because the AA fellowship, it's worldwide. You can find meetings everywhere and anywhere. Like you have an instant group of friends when you show up at a meeting, and we're all the same because we get it. We know what it's like
Mhm.
to not be in control of our own life if we put something in our body that makes us wacky. Um, but the church program, I feel like a lot of people were sent there as part of a repentance process.
Mhm.
And so they would go and they'd attend for a few weeks, or a few months. And then they felt like they were done. Like, oh, I don't have a problem anymore. And then even in the book, it said, basically return back to activity, accept a calling, get you to the temple, pay your tithing. It wasn't about now that you've gotten the help you need, stick around so that you can help other people who are in need. And that's the message of AA is like stay sober and then help other people. And so, but I did go to a church addiction recovery meeting every Sunday night for 15 years. And then for a few years before that, I just attended as I could. But I wanted to be there. So if, women particularly, if they showed up, that I would be there to be able to help them. The church program doesn't really push sponsorship, but I believe that's vital because recovery is a lifelong thing that, um, like I don't know. It's different for different things. I think I don't know about the people who came in for a shopping addiction, or like somebody who came in because they were addicted to their phone. That's not a life and death issue. So I don't know if you can actually just overcome that and then resume life. But yeah, I was really sad that there wasn't a community of um, people in the church program. There is a monthly fireside in Midvale, and that's kind of nice to go to, but it's still like you just listen to a couple people talk and then you go to a meeting afterward. It's not socials and activities and events like other 12-step programs have, where they involve your whole family and make it um, like if you had all bad friends now in recovery, you've got a lot of good friends.
Right.
So
Yeah, that's really interesting perspective. And as you talked about life and death, I mean, that's an interesting thing too, and why I have always really separated substance abuse from behavioral issues, whether it's gambling, which, by the way, gambling has the most research behind it as far as being a behavioral condition that really becomes dependent, like kind of like some brain aspects to that. And And I believe video gaming will probably be next, although it quite hasn't made it into the DSM quite yet, which is actually quite different with how pornography and sexuality show up, right? And that's, although a lot of people may catastrophize it like it's a life and death issue, most people are, their lives are not in danger if they're looking at porn or not looking at porn, right? Or masturbating or not masturbating. But it is, especially in certain cultures, just a very shame-based activity that that really does a number, I think, on people's self-identity. So yeah, it's really interesting to see how you were really coming at this from more of this substance dependence history in your own life, and seeing what kinds of things really helped you towards sobriety,
Yeah.
and the
Well,
limit.
and with the sexual addiction, it isn't necessarily a life or death issue, but I have been in meetings with guys who, I don't know if you know, but like pornography nowadays, you might be looking for, something kind of normal, but like all around the screen is like really horrible stuff that you weren't looking for, like torture and, you know, little kids and stuff like that. And when guys, and I'm just saying guys because I haven't heard a lot of women talk about this, but men where you can actually almost Uber sex now, like you just click on it and they'll show up at your door.
Mhm.
So these guys quickly go down a hole that destroys their family. They're excommunicated. They're just,
Mhm.
and it started just from look at naked people on the computer, but and that's why I'm a really big proponent of ethical pornography.
Yes, absolutely. And I do want to just clarify a few things. Usually images with kids don't just pop up. And if people are saying that, that's actually not really true, right? So there's a lot of pop-ups that happen with things that are claiming to have minors, like teenagers, which I also separate from child pornography, like children, like
Yeah.
pubescent children. You really have to get on the black market for that kind of stuff to come up.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
I'm talking about at least really young looking, like
yes,
not prepubescent children, but like,
right.
you
Like
know,
right. And the mainstream pornography sites have tons of things that will say teenage,
yeah,
teenage. Of course, 18 and 19-year-olds are teenagers, uh,
yeah,
but they are legal. And so there are a lot of like things that are being positioned, or even things like ancestral things like step parent,
oh yeah,
stepmother, and, stepchild or whatever, which again, I want to remind everybody, these are actors, right? And this is part of pornography literacy, and something that I feel is very important to talk to even to our teenagers about, to not believe what is being said, right?
mm,
That what's being said, just like in a movie, when you watch a rape on a movie or somebody getting killed on a movie, they're not actually being killed, they're not actually being raped in that scene, but they are
yeah,
depicting something. And so these scenarios that the pornography industry loves to just throw at people that are quite concerning, but
yeah,
they're not real. And so people need to understand the difference between those things. And again, I think it's part, like I also want to make sure we we talk about the research, that this slippery slope, like people just, go look at mainstream porn and all of a sudden they're, you know getting uber sex, is not typical at all. That's not a typical pornography journey. But I do think it's a much more relevant journey if you are dealing with those things in spaces of shame. It's much more
mm,
likely that those things will escalate for you if you don't have any permission, any support, any normalization of what this curiosity towards these sexual imagery is about, right? And so I just want to just kind of offer those clinical insights as you.
well, I got a face full of porn on my son's Chromebook from high school. I
Mhm,
didn't know.
mhm.
Like, we're really careful here. I've got lockdown permissions. They have to get my passcode to even look up something. I've tried to be really careful, but I didn't know that it was common knowledge with all the teenagers that they're handed a Chromebook and they can look at anything they want. And
Mhm.
I felt really naive because I thought it's a school issued device. Of course, they would have protections on there, but they don't. And well, they do, but they're really easy to get around.
Yeah.
And so that made me really sad because I think my son's been struggling with mental health a lot,
Mhm.
and just seeing all those images and a lot of the incestual stuff, and like so much anal sex. And I try to teach my kids like that's not real. you
Mhm.
know um it's really like, um it's not an accurate depiction of what most intimate relationships are like. And so just have to deal with that. And I made a complaint to the school district. I'm like, come on, you got to have something better.
Yeah.
but I don't mind if my kids look at, well, my older kids, I guess, my kids in their 20s. I'm just like, they believe in ethical pornography. And you
Mhm.
know
Yeah.
yeah.
I am totally on board with what you're saying. I think the protections are, quite frankly, I think they're kind of a joke. I think you can have a lot of tons of protections around, and although they can help, I'm not saying don't do them at all, but I just don't. I think there's always workarounds, both from on both sides, right? So I think our kids are very tech savvy, and if they want to get around certain protections, there's ways they can do it. And then, of course, the industry is trying to get around protections, right? And through either advertisings or pop ups or whatever those things are. So the answer here, especially if parents are listening, I don't think is to assume you're going to be able to keep porn from your kids. That should not really be the answer. The answer is, when my kid comes across porn, are they prepared to understand what they're watching and what they're seeing? And are they prepared by not just a discussion of what they should or shouldn't do, but a discussion of values and sexual ethics and responsibilities, and, like you're saying, like understanding what real sex looks like, right? I oftentimes make the comparison of Fast and Furious, right? Like, all of our kids go watch Fast and Furious. I think they kind of understand that's not how real people drive. Most of us don't have cars that look like that. Most of
Yeah.
us are not, driving a car off a 10-story building and landing into the next building safely. Like, they understand that because they get to drive with us every day, and they get to see what cars actually do, right? And
Yeah.
so that's the difference between a 16-year-old who's driving a car versus a 16-year-old who's looking at porn, who I hope hasn't had the experience to watch their parents have sex.
Right. Oh, yeah. I walked in on my parents once. Burned into my brain.
Right, or understand what bodies actually really look like without all this, like photoshopping. And that's where that porn literacy, I think, is so important, that we're not just stopping at the, oh, you shouldn't look at porn, that makes Heavenly Father sad, or something like that.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
really like, this is about understanding, first of all, media consumption, understanding industry and advertising, understanding how sexuality, like most things in life, is capitalized, right? And
Yeah.
sold, and trying to convince you about certain things. And what does actual sex look like, and what can you expect from an actual partner? And as you look at these images, especially when you're younger, you may not be prepared for some of this material, and it can impact your erotic template, right? And so how are you going to protect yourself from that? I think those are the conversations that I still yet don't think most parents know how to have, right, with
Yeah.
their children. Which
Well,
gets me, go ahead. But
I felt like I was doing really well with this son because 6 months ago, like, I know that since we left the church, like, my boys, they're in their room masturbating, and I just say, like, just don't be in there all day, like. But with my older son, I taught him about condoms. I bought a huge box. I gave him a copy of The Joy of Sex. Like, it's got illustrations that are very realistic, but it talks about everything from foreplay to STDs to AIDS to different positions and everything. And I thought that was good because it was a real, picture of, consensual sex and, like what people like. And it was just, I thought it was really good. But because my daughters, I feel so bad because if I walked on them masturbating or looking at porn, they'd lose their phone for a month. I'd say, you have to go talk to the bishop, and my oldest now, she says that was child abuse to make me go talk to the bishop. And I said, I'm so, so sorry. It's just that I had such a joyful repentance experience when I came back to the church that I was, trying to share that with the kids. And I did offer to go in with them when they went in to talk to the bishop, but they just thought it was weird more than anything. Like some middle-aged man they don't know, and like, but with my boys and now with my girls too, I just try and check in with them, make sure they're safe and healthy. And I was happy that my son told me that he's distributed a bunch of condoms to his friends. I'm like, that's great. I'll buy more. They need to be available, and they're not.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, that's so many interesting things, from your kids saying, hey, mom, that's a form of child abuse, which is such an interesting generational shift, right? From especially in Mormon land, where that just seemed to be like the correct thing to be doing as a parent, right? Is to hold these kids accountable and to not have any boundaries around sexuality. And everybody had a right to know what you were doing with your body and to your own body. And it really has shifted with a lot of the knowledge we now have about, the rights, just even basic human rights, right? Like it is under the basic human rights for people to have bodily autonomy. That is not something that we know how to do very well in LDS land, right? And I think, boundaries, right? Like, why do I have to answer a question that makes me feel uncomfortable, or that has to, the concept of privacy, right? That's a human right. And even the concept of having a right to sexual education, which again is oftentimes not afforded to minors in conservative cultures, to understand what's happening to their body, to understand that these are normal curiosities, to understand that these are normal drives, that to want to touch your own body either for pleasure or for self-soothing or for pain management or for sleep. Like that's actually a normal, healthy part of being a human. And so, although I'm sure that was a harsh critique to take from your daughters, that now they're saying, mom, this was a form of sexual abuse, I can understand their sentiment, right?
Yeah. Well, and it was a striking revelation to me about body autonomy. Like just thinking my whole life, I was taught that my body isn't mine. It's God's, and even my husband, my relationship isn't just us. Like Jesus is in between us, but like with the girls, I made them cover their shoulders when they had these really cute dresses. And I've just apologized so much, but they, I really want all my kids to know from this time forward, like your body is yours.
Yeah.
You can do whatever you want with it. Just don't hurt other people. But, it's your body. And, it just feels nice to be able to share that, because that just feels so much more true to me than perpetuating that someone's always watching. And, if you do something naughty, that contributed to Jesus being tortured to death. Like what a horrible, horrible thing to teach children, that if you do wrong things, like somebody was tortured to death because of some of the things you did. Like, oh, I can't believe it. Yeah, but it was really hard for me to stop wearing my garments, and I only stayed married 24 years because I didn't even consider it an option to divorce. And I should have divorced him like a couple of years in, because he's got untreated mental illness. But I wanted that Mormon dream, the homestead and homeschooling. But definitely big lessons.
One of the things that you had talked to me about before we met today was that you feel you've really shifted, and you're kind of touching on this, but that you've really shifted in the way that you parent your kids and that you really prioritize, sex positive approach now. So what would you say are some of the differences between how you parented before and how you're parenting now? I mean, I know you've said, you provide condoms, but what values are you teaching and how are you talking to them differently about it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would say that regarding pornography, I stress more like your brain is still developing and it's not so great like for brain development when you're an adolescent and um you know but I want them just to feel comfortable talking to me. And I think that's hard for kids because they don't want to like picture their parent knowing about sex, and um but I've told the girls, I've said, if you ever have an unwanted pregnancy, you know, I would definitely raise the baby, if you chose to give birth, like just telling them options that I wish that I'd had when I was their age. But my oldest daughter, I think she's probably going to come out to me as trans pretty soon because she changed her name to River, which is a cute androgynous name. She has a really androgynous look. Um, you know, she dates women and she has a boyfriend. Um, but I like she was the first person in the family to leave the church. And I was like, I don't care. I love you. There's nothing you could do that would make me upset with you or love you less. So I think that they know that I will accept them no matter what they choose to do and what they choose to believe. I used to say, well, you got to go to church. It's like eating your vegetables. You just got to do it. And, like you can have this knowledge of this religion. And then as an adult, you can decide, you have something to compare the other religions to. And now I just feel like it's more about just being kind to people. Like those are the values I'm teaching my kids and be out in nature. Anything can be your higher power. It can just be whatever makes you feel at peace and, connected to everyone and everything, really hippie kind of.
What ended up being kind of the things that led you out of the church? Because it sounds like the church in a lot of ways was a really well structured place for you to land, especially after this initial kind of recovery stuff that you were doing and helped you, which I think the LDS church is actually very good at this, of creating structure, creating community, creating a
Oh
space.
yeah, they're tops for sure.
Yeah. And anytime I've talked to people who've struggled, especially with coming from addiction in family, like substance addiction, or struggling with addiction themselves, this is kind of one of the things that really drew them to the church, is that the church was able to offer like structure and kind of family focused living in ways that sometimes is missing, in the mainstream culture. But we also know there's a lot of problems with the church. So what was it that drew you finally to say, okay, this is no longer a place where I feel comfortable?
It started with my kids. So my oldest daughter had struggled with scrupulosity. Like it nearly killed her because she's already a type A personality, perfectionist, oldest child. Everything lined her up to just feel like I'm never going to make it. I'm going to fail because I just can't be perfect. And I'm told I've got to be perfect. And so it kind of breaks my heart because I didn't know that she was struggling with that so much.
Yeah.
And my second daughter wasn't ever super into church because, like, she was having sex in cars in the high school parking lot when she was in ninth grade. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's way earlier than I thought. Like, I would need to be talking to you about this. But she liked going to church activities a lot. But my third daughter was literally the exact age of Helen Mar Kimball when Joseph Smith married her. And the whole thing about polygamy and Joseph Smith practicing it was brand new information to me 3 years ago. Brand new.
Okay.
I feel like I was taught that Brigham Young did it to save all the needy women and all the widows and everything like that.
Yeah,
And
that's the story I was given.
it just brushed off. But
Yeah.
so when I found out about the polygamy, because my daughter, she's just like, no, she was 14. She's like, screw that. I'm out. And I felt still at the time, because my dad was married to my real mom, and then they got divorced but stayed sealed, and he was sealed to my stepmom. So in my mind, I always felt like, well, I love both of my moms, so I don't really have a problem being with both of them, but didn't really go into polygamy as a practice as a whole. Um, but I started researching polygamy to try and find an explanation for my daughter that would help her see like why it's so holy that we can't even understand it or whatever. But I couldn't find anything in any of the manuals. There was not one word about it in Preach My Gospel. There was nothing, like there was only one line in Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, and it said Joseph Smith also taught the doctrine of polygamy. And that was it. It didn't say he did it and had a lot of wives. And so then I went to only church sources because I knew that Satan would get me if I just Googled it. And also I had a cup of coffee when we were on a cruise, and I like, oh, I gotta confess that to the bishop. I mean, I started thinking, wow, some of this is really ridiculous. But the Gospel Topics essay on polygamy, the language just felt like an abuser. It felt like, oh, you're just taking it to, you're taking it wrong, or it's not as bad as you think. And also the tricky language of she was a few months shy of her 15th birthday. Like, no, she was 14. Why are you trying to like be tricksy? So then I exhausted all the church resources. And as soon as I got on the internet and just started looking at Mormon polygamy, there were a lot of factual things. They weren't like anti-Mormon, whatever. But I started to realize how gruesome polygamy is. Like it's slavery. And I started listening to the A Year of Polygamy podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and read like The 19th Wife, and started listening to LDS discussions on Mormon stories. And the combination of Mike and Nemo and John, they were so comforting to me. And as I went through listening, like when I got to the part where the Tower of Babel never happened, the Garden of Eden never happened, like my mind was blown. Like there was no worldwide flood. And so just from that point on, I was like, wow, like even in the temple, we're lied to every time. And then my last thing was I kept questioning, like, am I just under Satan's influence? Like, what's going on? And I read the letter to my wife, which is kind of like the CES letter, but it's more personal, but it also includes all the masonry things that pertain to the temple. And when I saw the signs, the exact signs that we make in the temple, and saw their full meaning, I freaked, because my daughter had been suicidal and my sister committed suicide. And to find out that like our loving, perfect Savior Jesus wants you to kill yourself for any reason, like I was like, that's not okay. And so I zoomed over to the South Jordan Temple, and I went in for a session, and I sat at the back. And I mean, I'd been to the temple like 200 times. Like I loved it so much. I sat in the back and I was like, holy crap, I'm in a cult.
Wow.
And I just said to the person whose card I had, I said, I'll finish the session for you, just, out of respect for you, if you like this, but I went through, and then I asked questions of the matron when I left, and she lied to me. She said she had no idea what the signs mean. And she was like 70. So she'd been through the temple when when the full signs were given. And then I asked her why we have to pay tithing. And I think she caught on that I was, getting off track. And she said, just read your Book of Mormon. Just read your Book of Mormon. And it made me sad that she had lied to my face when I'd asked her an honest question. And as I left, the temple for the last time, I sobbed because that part of my life was over.
Mm.
And it had been something that I really, really loved. And then the Book of Mormon was the last to go, just finding out about all the changes that had been made. And so I had to just come to believe that the Book of Mormon is a book full of inspirational stories, some good moral lessons. Um, you know,
Wow.
yeah. And then I tried going to the addiction recovery meetings after because there was a really good women's meeting that's here in Sandy. And I couldn't do it because when they talked about characters in the Book of Mormon who I now knew don't never existed, it was like they were saying, and just like Mickey Mouse says, like scripture quote from an imaginary person. I just couldn't do it. And then there was a picture of Joseph Smith with the first vision on the wall. And I was just thinking, what version of the vision is that? So I was really sad because I wanted to hold on to part of it and to the community. But luckily I moved into a neighborhood where the bishop has had two kids remove their names from the church while he's been bishop.
Wow.
And the Relief Society president is really nuanced, just all about like love and service. And so it's been nice because I've been able to have a relationship with them a little bit. Um, I'm playing the piano for the choir, which is pretty low commitment. So
you still attend
no,
no.
no, I'll just attend when it's a practice or a performance. But
Okay.
they've been so good to me. Like they really have helped me as a newly single mom with a lot of kids.
Yeah.
And they didn't ask for anything back, but I really felt like I wanted to give back.
That's lovely.
But
Yeah.
not cleaning toilets.
And it's lovely when the best of the LDS value system shows up, versus the worst of it. I want to circle back really quickly. We're both victims of childhood sexual abuse. And so we both have like a visceral reaction, I believe, to understanding when there's something off about the justification of perpetration. So this, when you read through, the justifications in the LDS materials about polygamy and even this language about, a few weeks shy of 15, like 15 is any better.
Yeah.
I'm like, do you think that makes it better?
Right.
And this is oftentimes why we are raised in systems that excuse perpetration. That's not just the Mormon church. That's evangelical Christianity. That's the Catholic diocese, right? That's when people ask me, why are we so comfortable with even a president of the United States who's a sexual perpetrator? I'm like, because we were all raised in systems that we are used to justifying or excusing sexual perpetration.
And also like just ignoring that and looking at the good,
Right.
the good few things that they did. Like,
or the repentance process, like you said, like, oh, well, your grandfather, well, he repented, right? Which maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but that doesn't mean anything in regards to what his psychology and, his system, whether or not it's been actually treated or addressed, right? Or even held accountable. Even criminally accountable, right? We just don't hold most sexual perpetrators accountable in this country to this day.
Right.
The majority of sexual perpetrators are not held accountable.
And that horrible attitude that's given to the victims of, you better hurry up and forgive them or else you're the sinner.
That's right. That's right. So we should not be surprised. We should not be surprised that most of us belong to religions, that we currently have a president of our entire country, where this is the way that we have been socialized from very early ages. And therefore, we should also not be surprised that we continue to produce perpetrators, right? Like a 16-year-old boy who raped you, right? In a high school kind of scenario. That sounds shocking, but we should not be surprised until we do some real systemic work. And that includes all of the churches that need to do the systemic work, including very much the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, to truly address this in a trauma-informed and treatment-appropriate way, we are going to continue. And if people want to blame porn, or if people want to blame, porn is a big one that gets blamed for the slippery slope to pedophilia or whatever. People are going to continue to be victims of these crimes because that is not the issue. And even the issues around unethical pornography have very much to do with these systems that have excused predation for millennia. Yeah. So I just want to kind of speak to that because I noticed your visceral reaction as your faith transition started when you read something that I think you knew in your bones because you were a victim of sexual predation, that did not sit well with the explanation, right, that the church is giving in this space.
Yeah.
And of course that leads to all this kind of, dishonesty, the lying, right? The lying and the lying for the Lord, which many of us kind of understand what that means in LDS circles. But that is actually part of the value system, that actually dishonesty in order to save the Lord, which oftentimes really just means the church system, is very much embedded in our value system as well, right? So
sure, yeah. Well, and one of the things I first talked to you about when we met at Thrive was that when I left the church, my pornography addiction was magically gone.
Right.
Like, honestly,
that happened.
It's like, you know what? I might feel like, looking at it and having some me time, maybe a couple times a month. But I'm like, don't really feel like it, and I mean, that never was how it was before.
Yeah.
I
don't think people really truly understand the incredible impact of shame on behavioral modification, right? So many of us have behaviors we would like to shift or change, whether it's chewing our nails, how we eat, whether or not we're doing our sexuality in a certain way. And of course, tons of people in our communities are also monitoring us on that, how we look, whether or not we're keeping certain spousal agreements, which are very much based in LDS land on an ownership model versus a self-autonomy model. So people feel like they have the right to monitor each other's behaviors and thoughts. As long as we keep up those shame-based systems, behavioral modification will be very, very difficult. When people are free to be, to eat, to pleasure themselves, to, commune with other people in kind of natural, normal ways, many of those things just disappear.
Yeah.
But we still live in a very kind of puritanical culture, monitoring culture, and of course, even a capitalistic culture, which capitalizes on many of these things that we're all desperate to try to change about ourselves.
And, the talk about trying to get back to old-fashioned values, like the, beginnings of Christianity in the United States with the Puritans, those people burned women at the stake. Like, I don't really want to get back to those values.
I've never understood what everybody's looking so nostalgically at.
Right.
Other than, I guess, white patriarchal men, they have, I guess, I mean, if they want to just control and have power over everything, I guess you can have nostalgia over that. But it is very interesting, but it's also very systemic, right? I guess that's what I want to mainly point out. Even your struggles, right? Like if an LDS person hears of a woman who's having sex and masturbating when she was a little girl and having sex in her teens and then having 2 abortions and getting hooked on meth, oh, that's a cautionary tale. Nowhere in that cautionary tale are we talking ever about the trauma that you had as a young child that started the psychology of behavioral adaptation to self-soothe yourself through some very difficult challenges. Nor, of course, are we talking about the normal aspects of those behaviors that were normal, whether you would have had trauma or not, right?
I did have one therapist downtown Salt Lake City. She was LDS, and she was the only therapist that I saw from the church that ever told me oh, your masturbating is just self-soothing. And made me think it is. Like that really is. Like that makes me feel safe, makes me feel in control. So that was lovely.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
was masturbating before I was sexually abused, right?
Mm.
So that idea that we get sexualized as children and that's the only reason we start masturbating is also a huge myth, right? Like most children, even most toddlers, even quite frankly fetuses are stimulating their sexual organs. And kids are not doing that because they are, interested in sex with another person or
Yeah.
they're interested in pleasure, just like it's pleasurable to suck your thumb or to rub your ear or to hold on to your blankie, right? And so those are very pleasurable things that are helping you go to sleep and self-soothe. And especially if you're in a home where there's chronic abuse or neglect, you're able to take care of yourself. And so when we synophize these natural ways of taking care of ourselves, then it can become behaviorally modified in a way that becomes unhealthy instead of staying with the health parameters that were meant to be in our systems to begin with, right? So,
Yeah.
well, I know we're way over time. I thank you for
Yeah, you
I
can
thank you
edit out
for all
whatever
your
you need.
time, but this is a fascinating story, and I hope people can listen and either find ways that they can relate to you, or if your story is completely unrelatable, that they can start to understand, oh, that's like look at it from a different perspective, right? And I just want to thank you for the vulnerability that you've shared today, and because you've shared very tender private moments of your life, and I always am appreciative when people do that, because when we can share private moments that are personal, that hits so much more than just professionals talking about cases that are kind of more theoretical.
Yeah.
So
Well, and I also have had a lot of healing through having kids, because I feel like that was kind of like me making amends for getting rid of a couple babies. And then I had a baby die, and I'd named her Victoria after Christ's victory over death, which was perfectly fitting because she died when she was 3 months old. And in leaving the church and trying to decide, like, what is my higher power? I know she's there. I know she's here somewhere. And so it's nice to still have a spiritual connection to a real person that I can speak to, who I know really exists. So very sweet.
well, you've had quite a story. I'm super honored to have had you on the show, and also wish you the best as you have been victorious over many, many challenges in your life. And I hope that you continue to feel that way as you continue to navigate this journey that we're all on. So thank you so much, Colleen, for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's been great.
All right. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye.
Hey. All right. See you later.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Nahotishki say the Navajo. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart. 10,000 years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. Nahotishkishe the Navajo. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. Nahotishkishe the Navajo. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland